Associate Professor Angie Heo, the University of Chicago Divinity School. Associate Professor Feng Qiu Shi, Acting Vice Dean of Research at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, NUS. Associate Professor Jack Meng-Tat Chia, Convener of G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Cluster, NUS. Distinguished guests, esteemed alumni, professors, students, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ng Xiang Yun, a master's student from the National University of Singapore's History Department, and I'm truly honored to serve as the MC for the event this evening. A very warm welcome to everyone on this special occasion as we celebrate the launch of the G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Cluster at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. The G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Cluster, funded by an endowment established via a generous gift to honor Mr. Ghana Pragasam Lewis's memory, aims to foster the academic study of religious pluralism and diverse religious traditions in Asia and beyond. Our greatest thanks to the Lewis family for the generous endowment. This evening's distinguished lecture marks the launch of the G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Cluster. We are pleased to welcome the esteemed Professor Angie Heo from the University of Chicago as our distinguished lecturer. The lecture will be followed by a question and answer session, moderated by Professor Jack Meng-Tat Chia. Without further ado, let me first invite Professor Feng Qiu Shi, Acting Vice Dean of Research at the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, for his welcome remarks. Prof. Feng, please.
Good evening, dear Professor Heo Angie, and dear distinguished guests, colleagues, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this launch of G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Center. The Faculty of Arts and Social Science is featuring a very rich diversity of research interests and activities. Situated in a country at the intersection of East Asia and Southeast Asia, the faculty, as a part of National University of Singapore, is geographically well placed to develop area-based research that are well informed by disciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches. The research division at FASS aims to promote and support humanity and social science at NUS by fostering impactful research, encouraging interdisciplinary collaboration, and facilitating outreach to both academic and public audiences. Over the years, we have hosted a very diversified range of research clusters, including research cluster on family, child, and youth, language and linguistics, and Belt and Road Initiative, among many others. These clusters are guided by a coherent approach that fosters collaboration and drives the development of new research agenda and strategies. Currently, the research division manages 3 research centers and 3 research clusters, including today's one. We aim at creating a vibrant research environment within FASS and promoting its work to the external audience. Today, we're going to launch the G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Center, funded by an endowment established through a very generous gift in memory of Ghana Pragasam Lewis. We at NUS are very grateful to the Lewis family for their generosity and support in fostering the academic study of religion. This endowment reflects their deep commitment to advancing research on religious diversity and promoting meaningful interreligious dialogue within and beyond academic community in Singapore. The G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Center aims to foster the academic study of religious pluralism and diverse religious traditions. It seeks to explore the multifaceted landscape of religious diversity in Asia and beyond, providing a platform for interdisciplinary research and collaboration within the field of Religious Study at NUS. Additionally, it is a scholarly platform to host events that facilitate conversations among academics, practitioners, and the general public. I will now hand over the time to the convener of G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Cluster, Associate Professor Jack Martin Chair, who will introduce the research cluster and today's distinguished speaker.
Good evening, distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. It is my great honor to welcome you to the launch of the G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Cluster. Tonight is a special occasion as we celebrate the start of an important initiative that seeks to explore and understand religious diversity in new and meaningful ways. This cluster is made possible by the generous support of the Lewis family in memory of Mr. Ghana Pragasam Lewis, whose legacy of kindness and commitment to understanding inspires the work we aim to accomplish. Singapore is an ideal place for this important work. Our society is home to people from many different backgrounds, practicing a diverse array of religions and traditions. It is a place where religious diversity is both a reality of daily life and the foundation of our shared identity. However, as the world becomes more complex, understanding how people of different faiths interact peacefully, collaboratively, and sometimes with challenges has never been more important. This is the work that the G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Cluster aims to address. Through this cluster, we will host a range of academic events to bring together researchers, religious leaders, policymakers, and the general public. Our aim is to create spaces for deep conversations and to share new research that is relevant not only to communities in Singapore, but also to those around the world. By fostering these connections, we hope to advance academic understanding and contribute to meaningful dialogue on religion in pluralistic societies. As we launch this cluster today, I want to take a moment to thank the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, especially Dean Lionel Wee, Vice Dean Elaine Ho, and Acting Vice Dean Feng Chiu Si for their support in making this initiative possible. I also want to express my gratitude to my colleagues and steering committee members, Noor Amali Ibrahim, Irvin Johnson, Nina Mahadev, Vinita Singha, Wang Jingping, Faiza Zakaria, and Julius Batista, who have been instrumental in shaping this vision. Together, they bring a diverse range of research expertise, working across various religious traditions and offering insightful courses at NUS that enhance our understanding of religion in Asia and beyond. Lastly, I want to invite all of you to join us on this exciting journey. Whether you attend a lecture, participate in a seminar discussion, or simply take a moment to reflect on what religious pluralism means to you, we warmly welcome your involvement. Without further ado, please allow me to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Angie Heo. Angie Heo is Associate Professor of the Anthropology and Sociology of Religion at the University of Chicago Divinity School. After earning her PhD in anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley, she taught at Barnard College and held fellowships at Emory University and the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. Professor Heo is the author of The Political Lives of Saints, Christian-Muslim Mediation in Egypt, published by the University of California Press in 2018. It has published articles in leading journals such as American Ethnologist, Comparative Studies in Society and History, and the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. Her current research focuses on the history and politics of Protestant Christianity in Korea. Professor Angie Heo's lecture today is titled Border Wars and the Making of Religious Difference. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Heo.
What an honor to be speaking about my work for this special occasion. First off, congratulations to NUS for inaugurating the GL Lewis Religious Pluralism Research Cluster. I'm also absolutely delighted to find asylum here from the bitter cold of Chicago, now here in the warmth of tropical Singapore and Singaporean hospitality. Thanks to Jack Minchet Chia and Nina Mahadev for their kind invitation to join this gathering of hearts and minds. And thanks to Yak Chuan for all his logistical magic towards realizing this moment. So tonight we'll be exploring sites of religious pluralism with a spotlight on borders, and more specifically, territorial borders in times of war and conflict. In recent years, our world has witnessed a resurgent concern with borders. We're all familiar with the anti-migrant campaigns from Fortress Europe to MAGA America. Photos snapped at various border zones like this one, of refugees waiting at a European entry point, have become nearly iconic. Setting our sights on other geographies, the concern with borders may be less about migrants escaping from war and more about territorial tensions that invite the nervous potential for war. Here I'm thinking about border wars closer to Singapore, namely the PRC's saber rattling in the South China Sea. In all these questions, it's the question of the nation and the nation state that stands at the center of political debates around sovereignty, security, and asylum. Numerous scholars have examined the nationalist, racist, and economic aspects of border wars in important and much-needed ways. This evening, we'll be foregrounding another aspect of border wars. Religion, religious worldviews, religious communities, religious institutions continues to exert significant influence in popular life and political conflict throughout our world. This is such an obvious and self-evident fact, if not a banality. And yet, when it comes to understanding border wars, religion is so often read as the merely superficial expression to more primary, really political factors driving territorial threats and transformations. What is missing is an account of how religion is itself integral to our account of how people experience borders and border wars. I understand this lacuna in our understanding as evidence of the very reason we are here tonight, to launch serious and sustained research on where and how religion is active in sites of ongoing conflict and cooperation across different areas of our world today. So as Jack mentioned in his generous introduction, my research focuses on Egypt and Korea. I study religion as an anthropologist, and my home institution is the Divinity School at the University of Chicago. So like the Religious Pluralism Cluster here, the Divinity School is a collective of scholars who share an object of study, religion. And we take up a variety of methodological orientations: anthropology and sociology, history, theology, philosophy, ethics, and so on. As an anthropologist, I approach religion as a lived tradition and generally take my inspiration from ordinary and everyday expressions of religious ideas and questions, as opposed to, say, the deep and layered interpretation of texts, foundational scriptures, and so on. Since the early 2000s, I've been studying Coptic Christians and Coptic Orthodoxy in contemporary Egypt. My work culminated in my monograph, The Political Lives of Saints, Christian-Muslim Mediation in Egypt. As I began wrapping up my work in Egypt, I began a new project on Protestants in Cold War Korea, which allowed me to deepen my collaboration with colleagues working on Eastern Orthodoxy in Russia and the post-Soviet world. This is when I also began more explicitly thematizing my study of religion and borders in a more comparative and transregional frame of analysis. So tonight I'll be doing something I've never done before. I'm going to bring my work in Egypt and Korea together in one talk with the hopes that the juxtaposition between my two projects will provide insight into how different religious communities interact with threats, real and imagined, at their borders. To set us up for comparative perspective, I'd like to first offer some baseline facts on Christianity in Egypt and Korea. Christians in Egypt and Christians in South Korea are both religious minorities, if we take minority to be a strictly demographic designation. And that's really where the similarities end. The Orthodox and Protestant traditions could not really be any more different. We can even detect the significance by just looking at the churches here. On the left, we have the Coptic Orthodox Patriarchate Church of St. Mark in Cairo, the seat of St. Mark the Apostle, understood to extend back to the 1st century. The Coptic Orthodox are an ancient tradition, known in Western Europeans as the early Christians, and as the founders of the desert monastics and holy ascetics. On the right, we have a Korean Presbyterian megachurch in the heart of urban Seoul. The sleek, high-rise design that characterizes Protestant places of worship may be more familiar to Singaporeans. This particular church speaks to the very recent 19th century introduction of the Protestant faith to Korea by American missionaries. It also represents the confluence of Presbyterian prestige and late capitalism in South Korea's history of religious and economic growth as recent as the 80s and the 90s. These two distinct types of Christianity shape public and political life against the backdrop of war in Egypt and Korea at different historical moments. My objective here is twofold. First, I aim to show how religious practices and discourse play a major role in creating, maintaining, and transforming the border politics of occupation, asylum, and security. Religion, I hope to show, is not merely a secondary expression of nation states at war, but rather an active element in how people both experience and transform borders in palpable and meaningful ways. Second, I aim to examine how those various border politics give rise to religious difference, namely, the difference between Christians and Muslims. As we will soon see, in both Egypt and Korea, Christians have drawn on their histories and traditions to organize their relationship to Muslims in times of conflict and violence. So to elaborate on these 2 points, I'll be presenting 2 different cases of religiously mediated borders from my fieldwork. The first centers on the Egypt-Israel land border at the eastern edge of the Sinai Peninsula. As many of you likely already know, this border is a hotly militarized border, contested throughout the Arab-Israeli wars, and only finalized with the Egypt-Israel peace agreement in 1979, brokered by the late President Jimmy Carter. In my research, I found that military conflicts over borders are intimately connected to this visual poster of the Virgin Mary on the right. This image of the Virgin, Adra at-Tagalli, which is Arabic for the Virgin of the Apparition, is quite easily the most popular, ubiquitous image for the Coptic Orthodox in Egypt and the diaspora today. Despite initial appearances of Western origins, I'll be making the case that it's precisely the '67 war between Egypt and Israel which serves as the historical origin of this image and its popular dissemination. Hold on 1 second. Let me take a sip of water. Our example in Korea pivots to another region and an entirely different type of border politics, which involves 2 borders. The first is the Jeju Island maritime border. The second is the North-South Korean land border, the infamous and iconic emblem of the ongoing state of war in the Korean peninsula. As we'll soon see, these 2 borders converge in the unexpected arrival of migrants from across the Indian Ocean and China Sea. In 2018, a group of Yemeni refugees landed in Jeju seeking asylum. We'll explore how and why Korean Protestants ended up launching one of the most far-reaching and effective anti-migrant campaigns in South Korean history. Not all Protestants were involved in the campaign against Yemenis entering the country, but the coalition of conservatives who were involved reveal something about histories of displacement from Northern Korea that are particular to evangelicals and their own memory of religious asylum. So over the next half hour, I'll be presenting a good volume of information and materials at a quick pace. At the least, I hope you'll get an overview of different cultures of religion and their public expressions in politically fraught contexts. By the conclusion, I'll be telescoping out to the more general theme that inspires our gathering together today, the question of religious pluralism and how we might understand and assess the role that religion plays in the elusive politics of peaceful coexistence. In Egypt today, questions of peaceful coexistence center on Egypt's Coptic Christians and their relationship to the Muslim majority. As in the case of Singapore and the Council of Religious Harmony, the Egyptian state relies on its alliance with appointed religious leaders who are charged with maintaining order. More than anything else, it is a sectarian formula of government, that is the Coptic Church and its alliance with the Egyptian state, that is the leading determinant for how Copts are protected and represented in times of war and violence. The institutional ascendancy of the Coptic Church, in turn, raises questions around the role that Orthodox Christianity plays in shaping Coptic sensibilities about their belonging to the nation. When you look at the demographics of Egypt, Copts are a minority, composing roughly 8 to 10% of the population. And of that 8 to 10%, 90% are Orthodox. There are Coptic Catholics and Protestants who are the local expressions of historical missionary presence in Egypt. However, when I talk about Copts now in this lecture, I'm referring exclusively to the Orthodox. Since 1952, Copts have essentially relied on a post-colonial formula of church-state authoritarian government. Scholars have called this by different names: the church-state entente, the Pope-President alliance, the church-state alliance, and so on. Starting with President Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1956, the Coptic popes and spiritual heads of the Coptic Church also served and continue to serve as de facto political authorities. Here are photos of the three main alliances since 1952. I have to say that I couldn't find an image of President Mubarak and Pope Shenouda. I think maybe Mubarak's image has been scrubbed off the internet. So I just found an image of Shenouda and his son, Gamal Mubarak. But this is supposed to be functioning as a substitute placeholder for Hosni Mubarak. That was a long alliance, probably the longest Shenouda Mubarak. So on the face of it, relations between Copts and Muslims are relatively stable and, by some accounts, peaceful. In political protests during the 2011 uprisings, for example, Coptic Christians will often display their unity with Muslims in a show of solidarity. These displays of unity and solidarity can be undermined with expressions of sectarian violence, like church burnings and bombings or targeted killings at churches. In 2011, a particularly volatile year of upheaval and transition, this is the year of the revolution and the uprisings, Copts could be protesting hand in hand with their Muslim co-nationals in one moment, and then quickly facing the ashes of places of worship that had been recently torched, as in the case of Mbeba only months after President Hosni Mubarak's ouster. One of the main arguments in my writings on Egypt is that Christian-Muslim unity and Christian-Muslim sectarianism are not so much opposites as they are two sides of the same coin. The way I make this argument is through Coptic orthodoxy itself, the religious tradition itself, its visual forms and religious practices of making common senses of space and time. And this is where saints, holy saints, and intercessors between humans and God become extremely important in grasping the relationship between wars over territory and Christian-Muslim difference. So Coptic orthodoxy is an ancient tradition native to Egypt, and Saint Mark the Apostle is its founding figure. Saints, festivals, and processions that honor saints are at the heart of Coptic orthodoxy, especially at the popular level. Here is a list of some of the most popular saints. Saint Mark and the Virgin Mary are critically important to the Coptic Orthodox tradition of saint veneration. And all of these saints listed here lived and walked in Egypt, making Egypt a holy land. Among them, I would say the Virgin Mary is the most important for understanding Christian-Muslim relations. Why? Because Muslims in Egypt also honor the Virgin. As most of you already know, the veneration of holy saints far exceeds Egypt. The Mediterranean basin is full of churches and shrines devoted to the memory of saints, not only for the Orthodox, but also for Catholics, Latin and Eastern. Wherever Christianity spread, there are the traces of saints, and many of these saints are shared between different churches. Sharing, of course, can lead to boundary issues and contests over who gets what. So one of the most famous examples that you've probably heard of is the legend of St. Mark's body, and the Venetian sailors who stole St. Mark's body from Egypt, hiding it across the waters, all to establish a new patron saint for a new ruling class in the 9th century. This is the origin story of the Basilica in Venice, Italy. Some of you might have gone and seen the Basilica. Saints and their shrines are also known to bring together people of many faiths. They are the quintessential sites of mixed interaction between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. So historians and anthropologists working on the Mediterranean East, namely Egypt, the Levant, and the Balkans, have offered a lot of interesting work on these interfaith crossovers. And here's just a selection of only a few titles among a whole industry of scholarship on this topic. So far, I've been directing attention to two main characteristics about Egypt's Copts and Coptic Orthodoxy. One, that the cult of saints offers potentials and perils of Christian-Muslim interaction. And two, that the Coptic Church and the Egyptian state became partners in Egypt's modern history, beginning especially from its post-colonial status as a fully fledged independent country from 1952 on. These two conditions came together in the 50s and the 60s after the creation of Israel in 1948 and President Nasser's role as the leader of not only Egypt, but also Arab nationalism. Throughout the Arab-Israeli wars, and is tragically made evident in the present, land and territorial sovereignty is the core issue at hand. It is in this context of contested borderlands that the Coptic Church and the Virgin Mary come into the political picture in a visually spectacular fashion. In April of 1968, the Virgin appeared in Zaytun, a middle-class neighborhood in northeast Cairo. It's hard to exaggerate how important and widely known the Marian apparition of Zaytun is for Coptic Christians today. The Marian apparition of Zaytun is probably the most important cultural event and religious phenomenon in contemporary Coptic history. These are just a sample of popular images from Zaytun, and there are numerous others. And to be clear, I'm not making a claim about whether or not the Virgin really appeared or if the apparition was true, and nor do I don't find it a particularly interesting topic and a problem to solve. But if you're interested in this, there are miracle hunters and debunkers out there who've conducted their own scientific investigations on whether or not Zaytun was real or a hoax. So there's a whole industry of writings and publications around this topic, but it's not something that I work on. Where my interests lie, rather, is in what it means that the Virgin appeared in Zaytun, how the Virgin was perceived to appear, and how her appearance was believed and ratified in a social setting. This is what we might call the social phenomenology of Marian apparitions. There are several features of the Zaytun apparition that are crucial for understanding the novelty of her form and the collective event. 1, the Virgin appeared as a burst of light. 2, she appeared on top of a church building. 3, she appeared repeatedly, night after night, although not consistently. And 4, most importantly, she appeared in view of a mass of spectators, mixed crowds of Christians and Muslims who gathered in Zaytun to, quote, see for themselves. Within a month of its initial viewing, the apparition was ratified by the highest political and religious institutions in Egypt. The state newspaper El Ahram reported the Coptic Pope Kyrillos' stamp of approval. President Nasser also reportedly submitted his own eyewitness account of seeing the Virgin himself. Above all else, it was the devastating shock of a war that consumed Egypt and the Arab world at the same time as the miraculous viewing of the Virgin. Only a year before, Egypt had lost the Sinai Peninsula to Israel in the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. And as you can see from the maps here, the 1967 invasion resulted in Israel's occupation of the Sinai, in addition to its takeover of the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Although the war lasted only 6 days, the territorial transformation in state borders was dramatic, with consequences that continue to haunt the region nearly 60 years later, and indeed not just the region, but the world. For tonight's focus on religion and borders, I want to step back and point out one key element in the drama of the Virgin in 1968. When she appeared in Zaytun, Egyptians commonly said, echoing Pope Kyrillos, the Virgin visited us because we could not visit her. Yes, many saw the apparition as a sign of consolation and comfort in a time of defeat. But the most interesting interpretations focused on the relationship between the appearance and the territorial condition of loss, dispossession of the territory of the Holy Lands. This claim, the Virgin visited us because we could not visit her, placed the causal connection between the image and the border at the forefront of the religious imagination. When Coptic Christians talk about visiting the Virgin, they're referring to a specific itinerary of sacred pilgrimage. The Holy Flight refers to the event relayed in the Gospel of Matthew, when Joseph, Mary, and the Christ child fled to Egypt to escape King Herod's order to kill all the boys in Bethlehem. From the 4th century on, the itinerary of sacred sites in Egypt honored the imagined traces of the Virgin's journey with the Christ child. So here is a map of the pilgrimage itinerary produced by the Coptic Church, and apologies because I know some of the items are a little difficult to read and discern because of the quality of the image. But this is an image produced by the Coptic Church. It is a representation from within the Coptic Church of the sacred itinerary of pilgrimage that is supposed to represent the Holy Flight. Although it is primarily Copts who do this entire pilgrimage, there are Muslims who join at specific points. The whole ritual affirms Egypt's status as a special holy land and in relationship to Israel-Palestine, especially the holy sites in Bethlehem and Jerusalem. Recall that the 1967 war resulted in Israel's occupation of East Jerusalem. This meant Israel's occupation over the old Christian quarter. Beginning in 1967, Copts, in solidarity with Muslims, stopped performing pilgrimage to Israel-Palestine. This is a key point. The Virgin's appearance in 1968 was interpreted as a divine provision in response to the cessation of crossing the border into Israel. The apparition was, in short, a sign of divine approval for a nationwide ban on pilgrimage to Israeli territories. It's worth briefly noting that even after Egypt and Israel normalized relations and signed a peace treaty in 1979, the Coptic Church maintained its ban on pilgrimage to Israel. This is an interesting moment, and I think one of the only few moments when Pope Shenouda departed from President Sadat by maintaining Egyptian Christianity's state of war with Israel. So as for the miracle of the Virgin, after the bursts of light in Zaytun stopped, the apparition itself became an image to be honored. As you can see, the apparition has even reached the visual status of an icon itself. So there's so much more to say about Marian apparitions in Egypt, and as I mentioned before, I've given lectures just solely on Marian apparitions in Egypt, but I'd like to also feature some of my material from Korea, so I'm going to shift in a little bit. But to wrap up the first half of my talk now, I want to point out what this image does and signifies for Coptic Christians and their relations to Muslims today. The Virgin of the apparition is currently part of the everyday visual landscape throughout public spaces all over Egypt. Some of you may have even already encountered this image as tourists in Egypt. So now you know the whole story behind this image, its historical origins in the Arab-Israeli War of 1967, and its religious expression through pilgrimage and deep traditions of saint veneration. Most of the time, as in the case in this photo, you'll find her in the context of a village or neighborhood like Shobra in Cairo, famous for its high density of Coptic Christians. Muslim locals, like these women, casually pass by the image, to be sure, but as a whole, the Virgin of the apparition is seen to be a Christian-specific image, part of a broader sectarian landscape that separates Christian spaces of piety from their Muslim counterparts. The irony is that, for Coptic Christians, the Virgin of Zaytun is the symbol of Christian-Muslim unity. It is the Virgin Mary's appearance in 68, after Egypt's loss of the Sinai and access to Jerusalem, which is reminded for bringing Coptic Christians together with Muslim co-nationals under the sign of Egypt. The fact that the Virgin of the apparition image has become more of an exclusively Coptic image, now as compared to 68, speaks to the increasingly sectarian conditions of Christian-Muslim coexistence in Egypt today. The transformation in the image's meaning also speaks to the power of religious traditions and rituals to transform how Christians perceive their place in Egypt and their potential for religious images to create new possibilities for interacting with their Muslim neighbors. So unlike in Egypt, sectarianism is not a common term used to describe the religious landscape in South Korea. The South Korean state does not maintain official relations with any religious organization. This does not mean that all religious groups carry equal political weight and influence. In Korea, the unequal politics of religious difference is more a function of lobbying and organized electoral power. Christians in Korea are technically a minority, but they're certainly not beleaguered. As you can see here, the majority of Koreans claim no religious affiliation. Muslims are less than 1%, and 70 to 80% of them are migrant workers from Bangladesh and Pakistan. If you're interested in the breakdown of Protestants in Korea, I've listed the major denominations here, but there are numerous others. The key point I want to make here is this. Even though Protestants hover at only 20%, they're a serious force to be contended with in public and political spaces. Within the Korean Protestant churches, as in the case with all Protestants, there's an entire spectrum of political orientations. My focus here lies on the conservatives. Conservatives in quotes, as opposed to mainline Protestants. They include I would say they include the first columns of denominations listed there. I'm making this selection. It's not, I don't think everybody would agree about this. And I'm going to say this is an enormous slice of the pie. Above all, Korea's conservative Protestants are legendary for their mass protests and organized political action. I kind of have this feeling that some of you might have encountered this, at least in some way, that you have seen it in media or that you understand and have in classes or in even through your colleagues and friends might have learned somehow about Korean Christian Protestants and their potential to organize on mass scale. Here's just one recent example of one of their protests last October. This one was a protest against anti-discrimination legislation that's still up for consideration in the National Assembly. The important thing I want you to flag here is the enormity of the scale. over 1 million on the streets of Seoul. I understand that protests like this do not occur in Singapore. Okay, I just learned this, okay. So one front where the conservative Christian bloc has made its mark in South Korea is on the highly charged issue of border security. For historical and ideological reasons, Korean Protestants have particularly deep-seated investments in fortifying the north-south border. So I'm going to elaborate more on this important point in a bit. For now, I want to direct attention to the ways in which Protestant orientations towards the north-south border shaped how they understood migration and the moral subject of asylum in religious terms. These Protestant values centered on religious identity and the policing of borders came together most vehemently in what was called the Jeju refugee crisis of 2018. So to understand this crisis, I just want to explain a little bit about South Korea and its different border zones. South Korea has different border entry points for migrants, tourists, and residents alike. One state border that has unique conditions for entry is Jeju Island. Just out of curiosity, has anyone here been to Jeju Island? Oh, you have? Okay, well, that's lovely. You're going to get another taste of Jeju Island, I think, tonight, okay? Since 2006, the South Korean government granted Jeju province special autonomous status to run an independent visa policy in order to promote tourism development. What this meant in practice is that Jeju's visa-free policy led to more open borders for tourists, migrant workers, and foreign investors, until 2018, when everything changed. In April and May of 2018, over 500 Yemenis landed in the airport of Jeju Island. Over 90% of the 500-some Yemenis were men. Nearly all these men were single and young, with an average age of 28 years. Most of them were Muslim, but there were a handful who professed atheism, and for this very reason had experienced personal attacks back in Yemen. For South Koreans, 500 Yemenis is a relatively small number of Arab migrants, especially compared to the thousands who had been already residing on the mainland. But for Jeju's islanders, 500 Yemenis amounted to an abrupt and concentrated arrival of a foreign presence that was unlike the more familiar Chinese and Southeast Asian tourists who had come before them. Where did these Yemenis come from? Since 2014, Yemen has been embroiled in an ongoing civil war. This is a dated map of the regions occupied by the Iran-backed Houthis and the Saudi-backed coalition. As a result of the war in Yemen, more than 4 million Yemenis, more than 10% of the country's population, have been forced to flee. The majority are displaced within Yemen's borders, and nearly 80% of these internally displaced are women and children. The much smaller percentage who end up leaving Yemen altogether were young men. Most headed to neighboring countries, especially to Djibouti, which agreed to host UN refugee camps for them across the Red Sea. Of the 200,000 majority young single men who left Yemen altogether, about 3,000 ended up taking flights across the Indian Ocean to set up temporary homes in Southeast Asia. Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, right next door, ended up being a popular destination. Most of the Yemenis arriving in KL after 2014 already had family networks in Malaysia. So as many of you already know, there's a rich history, centuries long, of Indian Ocean trade which spanned from East Africa to Southeast Asia. Many of you know or have heard of Angie Heo, who wrote a much celebrated historical ethnography which covered just this region through generations of Hadrami diaspora from Yemen. So if you'll permit a brief digression, I just want to give a quick shout out to one of the faculty members in the J.L. Lewis Research Cluster, Irving Chan Johnson. It's right there in the first row, who was the very first person to put me in touch with Aung San over 25 years ago. So it just shows you. Yes, you were the one. Yes, you were. Yes. Many of the Yemeni youth, after staying a year or so in KL, were naturally restless from the lack of work. They were also fed up with the constant fear of being arrested or deported. By 2018, a group of young Yemeni migrants in Malaysia were looking to travel again. They did research online and set up social media chats. From my interviews with them, I learned that 3 basic conditions were non-negotiables for their next destination. 1, they wanted safety. 2, they were seeking job opportunities. And 3, they wanted to find a country with human rights. In their hunt for a possible destination, these young Yemeni men discovered that South Korea is one of the few states in Asia who signed the 51 Refugee Convention, and that it's the first Asian country to enact its standalone refugee law in 2013. In other words, Yemenis imagined the important prospect of asylum, that is the acquisition of a legally protected status accorded to refugees. I will return to this slide later. But for now, recall that Jeju Island has a visa-free entry system to encourage tourism. Nowhere else in South Korea could Yemenis enter the country, only Jeju Island. So when Yemenis learned about Jeju and new bargain budget flights from KL to Jeju via Air Asia came up, it was really just a confluence of various factors. They packed up, they buckled up, and they took their chances. It's a big high risk to do this. The arrival of the Yemenis in Jeju prompted what quickly became known as the Jeju refugee crisis. The Yemenis entering into Korea by way of Jeju came to be a flashpoint for airing concerns with increased migration and so-called weakened border security. South Korea maintains and regulates different kinds of borders. When the issue of border security comes up, the archetypal reference is the North-South Korean border at the 38th parallel. The issue of border security is understood, in other words, as a matter of war. That summer of 2018, Koreans organized protests and belted slogans from all sides, with the 500 plus Yemenis at the center of their protests. Opponents to granting Yemenis asylum voiced nation first, while supporters condemned anti-migrant racism. And these protests occurred both on Jeju Island and also on the mainland in Seoul. Protestant conservatives were the leading architects of the anti-asylum movement. Unlike in Europe, where geographic proximity to North Africa has yielded centuries of interaction with Muslims, the Korean encounter with Islam is relatively recent. When the Yemenis arrived in Jeju, Protestants emphasized their origins as foremost Muslims and Islamic. Here we see the protest signs which equate Yemenis with the alleged dangers of Islam and calls on the Korean church to wake up and mobilize against their entry into Korea. The fact that Protestants take the lead in Islamophobic rhetoric takes on Korean-specific characteristics that are a direct result of evangelical missionary activity abroad. The Yemeni refugee issue, indeed, was only one instance among numerous instances when conservative Protestants expressed their platform against Islam. In the last decade, they have been the most vocal in opposing Muslim migrants and sexual minority rights in Korea, culminating in their large-scale opposition to anti-discrimination legislation. So to reiterate, for Korean progressives, the scale of their organizing capacity is impressive, effective, and simply impossible to ignore. For asylum seekers like the Yemenis in Jeju, For asylum seekers like the Yemenis in Jeju, the Korean perception of a deserving refugee is critical for their self-presentation. In law and in the public, the distinction between the true refugee and those who merely pretend to be refugees makes all the difference in who gets to stay within the borders of the Korean state and under what conditions. Numerous scholars have elaborated on the Cold War origins of the refugee law in North America and Europe. South Korea's history of refugee recognition after the Cold War is directly related to its internal history of civil war and division. In 1992, when South Korea adopted, remember 1992 is the so-called end of the global Cold War, but certainly in South Korea, still dealing with an ongoing state of war which is the continuation of Cold War. In 1992, when South Korea adopted the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, it was the North Korean refugee who was imagined as a subject of protection and sometimes religious salvation. Within a couple decades, the South Korean government had granted asylum to over 30,000 North Korean migrants, 70% of whom were women, and over 80% of whom sought resettlement support from churches and Christian organizations. There's a whole history. Apologies, I can't find good maps of this, and I know there's a lot of information packed into this slide, but it's a very simple message I'm trying to convey with the slide, so just give me a second. There's a whole history behind why Christians in South Korea are eager to aid North Korean refugees. After World War II, the Cold War territorial division of the Korean Peninsula led to early war refugee border crossings. Before the division in 1945, there was a high concentration of Protestant Christians in the northern regions of Korea. Some of you may have heard of the Pyongyang Revival of 1907, which captures the imagined origin of Protestant evangelism in the north, not the south. Pyongyang Revival referring to Pyongyang, North Korea. During the Korean War, numerous Christians headed south. At the war's end then, a disproportionately high percentage of Protestant Christians in the South were displaced migrants of Northern Korean origin. This refugee identity was so widespread that the Korean term for war refugee crossers to the South became virtually synonymous with Christians or anti-communists. Popular perceptions of what deserving refugees really look like are shaped by historical portraits of refugees from Korea's own history. They feature impoverished women and children, families moving together by foot. Again, there's a lot of information packed into these images, but we can return to them if you'd like. Fast forward to nearly 70 years later when Yemenis land in Jeju as a result of their own civil war. Judging by external appearances, their profiles were the polar opposite of the Korean War refugees: single, male, young, and middle-class airline passengers with cell phones, luggage, and yes, as some Korean news outlets were quick to report, high-end Nikes. So apart from Christians, many Koreans believed that the Yemenis were imposters, feigning persecuted status to sap the country of its resources and opportunities. Christian conservatives, however, did a lot of work to equate these young Arab men with rapists, criminals, and terrorists. Others still emphasized their right to express their racist and Islamophobic fears by invoking the trope of national security. Quote, "It's not about hate, we want safety," end quote. So within weeks of the Yemenis' arrival, more than 700,000 Koreans had signed an online petition calling on the government to revoke the Yemenis' refugee applications and expel them from the island. Although this didn't end up happening, the refugee recognition process only ended up yielding 2 successful applicants out of the more than 500. The vast majority of applicants ended up with temporary and renewable 1-year stay visas. The whole refugee crisis prompted by the Yemenis ended up transforming border regulations for Jeju Island. Only a few months after the protests and counter-protests began, changes in the visa-free policy began afoot. So this was within 2 months of their arrival. Back on the mainland, the South Korean Ministry of Justice added Yemen to the list of 11 countries excluded from Jeju's visa waiver policy, effectively putting a stop to Yemenis landing in the airport from Kuala Lumpur. Today, citizens of 23 countries, mostly from Africa and the Middle East, Central Asian regions, are now newly excluded from visa-free entry policy of Jeju Island. Shutting up borders to migrants is obviously a widespread phenomenon that exceeds the Yemeni refugee crisis in Jeju Island in South Korea. As I speak, and I'm an American, the newly inaugurated President Trump is carrying out the first stage of his mass deportation campaign this week in the city of Chicago. Indeed, the question of migration and borders has proven to be one of the most effective rallying points for far-right nationalists worldwide. For the Yemenis escaping civil war in Yemen, South Koreans offered a potential ally as historical subjects and legatees of their own civil war. As we learned, this hope was definitively dashed. So here tonight, I'm making the case to you that it's only through understanding the Protestant-specific history of refugees and the cultural clout of conservative Christians in politics that we can grasp how and why the Korean public was so hostile to young Arab men seeking asylum. And yet, the inaugural encounter of Koreans with Yemenis also led to small advances in cultural diplomacy, especially, as always, in the realm of food and film. Jeju's encounter with Yemenis resulted in one popular restaurant featuring Yemeni cuisine, whose co-owners ended up getting married. I know at least one other Korean-Yemeni marriage that ended up resulting from that summer, and who knows what happened after I left. I recall the optimism of one Korean human rights lawyer who said these words toward the end of the whole fiasco. He said to me, "Before the Yemenis landed in Jeju, Koreans did not know anything about Yemen, and now they do. Educating the public takes time, and all of this is an opportunity to learn about other cultures, regions, and religions in the world." So taking up this call to seize the opportunity to learn and grow, I'll close with some brief thoughts on the core theme that animates our launch together, religious pluralism. Reflecting on my talk so far, I can anticipate that all of what I've said so far may be easily taken to be a string of cautionary tales. What does the Jeju refugee crisis, for example, teach us about the perils of racially encoded religious identities? When does the Coptic tradition of miraculous appearance advance intercommunal concord, and when not, and why not? Following the textbook definition of religious pluralism, Korea and Egypt both solidly qualify as countries who have its main components. One, the existence of a diversity of religious beliefs and practices, and two, the coexistence of religious communities in the same society. And yet, when we use the term religious pluralism, we know that the straightforward fact of religious communities existing side by side is simply not enough. Harmony, indeed, is the social and moral value baked into the term. Read in this sense, Christian-Muslim relations in Egypt and Korea exemplify failures or shortcomings towards realizing the peaceful balance between religious groups. Recall, for example, the sobering fact that violent attacks on Egypt's churches unfolded so quickly after the grand theatrics of interfaith harmony in 2011. Or in the case of Korea, how such a small group of young, vulnerable foreigners from the Arab world could so easily disrupt the tranquil vibe of Jeju Island's strictly touristic variation on racial and religious tolerance. Peaceful coexistence and the harmony of faiths are recognizably noble ideals. To realize these ideals in substantive and enduring ways is an elusive task, to say the least. I want to suggest, by way of an inconclusive offering, that religious pluralism is not so much a normative or prescriptive benchmark to be attained, achieved, or even celebrated. Rather, religious pluralism is an open-ended project whose defining means and ends are under constant negotiation through the inevitable process of religious traditions and communities moving through history together. As a civic value, religious pluralism additionally requires thoughtful pedagogy and sensitive attention to context. So here is where I'm thrilled to see what NUS's G.L. Lewis Religious Pluralism Cluster will do in the coming years. Indeed, tonight's launch is just the beginning of such an open-ended project, one that crucially depends on the work of talented minds with experience and wisdom. Here in this room, our launch brings together students and scholars who are curious and motivated to understand different realms of religious thought and life, and the social and historical conditions that allow their differences in between to fully, freely, and peaceably flourish. To my mind, it is especially exciting to see NUS take the lead in situating these questions from within the regional perspectives of Asia, Asian societies, and Asian geopolitics. This is where I believe NUS has established a proven track record in making its mark, your mark, on scholarly innovation throughout the Anglophone Academy. And so, on that auspicious note, please allow me to offer my congratulations to the faculty, students, and the broader NUS community for launching an extraordinary and much-needed platform to ask and address the most challenging questions about religion and religious difference in our contemporary world today.
Thank you very much, Professor Heo. We would now like to commence the question and answer session. And for this, I would like to invite Professor Chia to the floor to moderate the session. Prof. Chia, please.
Thank you, Xiang Yun, and thank you, Professor Heo, for your really wonderful and thought-provoking lecture. And if I may take the opportunity to ask the first question, and I want to continue the conversation we had over lunch today, which is about your research from your first project on Egypt that you share with us this evening, and your new project on Christianity in Korea. So I'm just wonder, like, what are like the challenges you encounter looking at religious pluralism and the kind of the differences between studying the Middle Eastern context and the East Asian context. So like, what are some of the similarities yet differences that you encounter in your fieldwork, but also what are like the challenges you encounter moving like your research side from the Middle East to Asia?
The challenges that I've encountered shifting from Egypt and Korea might also be a function of when I began studying Korea as a mid-career scholar. Had I begun studying Christianity in Korea as a doctoral student earlier, I think, and then moved to Egypt later on, I think there might have been some conditions about field work and training that would have allowed me to do a different kind of project on Korea. But let me start with this. So I am American, but I'm of Korean heritage. And so I'm finding that my relationship with the Korea project is inflected by a certain kind of commitment that goes beyond scholarly inquiry, but in some ways I can see that I also have a commitment, or I'm motivated by commitment that's deeper than an academic commitment, and even exploring that question is not something that's necessarily fostered by the institutions of learning in which we're trained and raised, and so on. So that is a very difficult and an interesting kind of journey. Methodologically, what that means for me is that I'm positioned right now in the divinity school, and I see it. If I were in an anthropology department, I think it would. I would not be so interested in thinking with history and theology in ways that enable me to explore dimensions of Protestant Christianity that also allow me to do more kind of work that speak to Korean Americans and the Koreans in the diaspora writ large about their, who are interested in other perspectives about the heritage of their faith and how it links up to really, I would say, and I'm going to use the word our position in the world, but I mean, there's something very specific about being in North America. If you're Protestant, disproportionately high percentage of Korean Americans are Protestant, belong to Protestant churches as opposed to in South Korea. So there's ways in which it allows me to explore the second project, the asymmetries of Protestant heritage in the U.S. and South Korea. Now, the Egypt project, I began embarking on that project as a doctoral student, and I was trained by two prominent anthropologists of Egypt, Saba Mahmoud and Charles Hirschkind, and there was a way in which that allowed me to enter into an already established terrain of scholarly inquiry about secularism, about what a tradition is and how exploring the politics of a tradition might enable us to ask questions about democracy and secularism in different ways. And so I think that project was already delimited not in a productive way, that made field work a more kind of an easier kind of project to navigate than as opposed to, I think, my work in South Korea. So, and really the Koreas together. That's a little bit of a long-winded response, and it's not even, but if people want to follow up on that, I'm very happy to engage. But I think it's a complicated question because I wish I could say that I think a lot of it is a function of also where one is in their career and what kind of time and what kind of resources one has. So much of, I think, work is contingent on what resources we have and where we are in our careers.
Thank you, and we look forward to reading your next book. And now I will open the floor for questions. Please use the microphone located on the two sides, and if you ask a question, please identify yourself. Yes, please.
Thank you for the talk. My name is An Ting. I am an alumni of NUS. And yeah, it was very enlightening. I also want to thank Professor Jack for tweeting about it. That's how I got to know about the lecture, because as an alumni. So my question is, the second question was answered by you. So my first question was, how do you decide to study the Egypt, Israel, and specifically Coptic Christianity? Because I believe Chicago or California is a very long way away from Egypt.
Yes,
so just curious, was it your mentors that studied Egypt, or was it something else? And specifically, why Coptic Christianity and this, your area of study? So I'm just curious what informed it. Thank you.
Sure. So I ended up studying Marian apparitions only because the Zaytun apparition was so prominent everywhere that I went in Egypt when I was. So I didn't set out to study the Virgin Marian apparitions. I didn't even know it was really a phenomenon before going to Egypt. It was this classic kind of romantic note. You have this romantic notion of going to the field and then you find something, you realize you're going to study something you would never imagine you'd study. I had this idea when I was in my early 20s that I was going to go to Egypt and study theology and interfaith discussions between religious clergy and then figure out what all the faiths kind of shared in common and how to advance it. And turned out no one actually did interfaith dialogue. Was a kind of state-sponsored institution, and everybody who I talked to, Christians and Muslims alike, would say this is really more a charade that enables us to speak in the terms of religious unity in the public, but the actual contents of religious traditions and what Christians and Muslims share and do not share is a completely other. No one talks about theology in their homes, right? So then I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, okay, what is it then that brings Christians and Muslims together? And then I realized there's a whole scholarship on saint veneration in North Africa. I mean, it's a classic topic of anthropological inquiry, but a bunch of historians, I put some of the literature up there. It's a long-standing kind of point of discussion. So then, and you have to imagine, I come from a Presbyterian background. I'm learning about saints. We couldn't even put crosses up in the, or that was the kind of church background I come from. So all of a sudden I'm going into churches, and it felt like an assault of images, but that's not how I experience it now. But I remember just thinking, I have to deal with this. I have to deal with these forms of mediation. And then it just, basically occupied and consumed me for in my 20s and 30s. Now, how did I end up going to Egypt? I am still a headstrong person, but I was especially headstrong in my early 20s. And I remember when I was in college, I taught a bunch of refugees English. We had a kind of volunteer program, as many undergraduate colleges have volunteer programs. I was teaching refugees from Somalia and Bosnia, because that was, those were the wars that were taking place, the outcome of the wars that America was waging abroad. And so, and I found that I was hanging out with colleagues who were Muslims, and the students were Muslims, and then I realized I didn't know enough about Islam, and it was very important for me to go. I had this idea, I have to go to a place where Islam is the majority religion and Christians are the minority religion, so that I could figure out how Christians understand how important Christianity is for Christians in contexts where they don't have power per se. And so that's what got me to Egypt. And really it was totally wild because I just chose a country that I thought was relatively safe and at that time, and just landed there and taught English and decided I was going to go and figure this out, you know.
My name is James Sidaway. I teach geography. Thank you so much. And of course, as I say, I teach here in the geography department, and it was especially wonderful to see your maps there. But to hear your words and the relationship between those words and maps and images is really, took us on a wonderful journey. But my question, which I'll keep brief, is at the end, in discussing the cluster and the agenda for the cluster, you mentioned Asian geopolitics. There it was, the word, the G word, the geopolitics word. What work is geopolitics, or to be more specific, the adjective Asian geopolitics doing in the agenda for the cluster, as you saw it? For you were enunciating. I'm sure you have your words written down somewhere.
Of course, yes,
yeah.
But they're in here.
I can come and get the text. Exhibit A, you were enunciating amongst the agendas. Yeah. You made a reference to Asian geopolitics in talking how the cluster, the challenges the cluster would face. What work is Asian geopolitics doing in the agenda for the cluster? I mean, I could ask you to tell us what Asian geopolitics is, but I think I've had my time.
I see NUS as classically positioned to address that issue of what it means, Asian geopolitics, and what its implication is for epistemologies, or let's say, methods of approaching questions of religion and politics in Asian contexts. By Asian geopolitics, I would say, maybe I should say something like, one of my concerns for research on Asia in the Anglophone Academy is I have a bit of a concern, although this might be outsized, and this might be more something that I see happening in certain corners of research on Asia, is the reproduction of American paradigms for studying power and culture in Asia. And I think it's important for research on Asia to develop methods and fresh perspectives from within and inside the Asian context. And that includes understanding the geopolitics, or let's say inter-Asian relations, inter-Asian hierarchies, the ways in which there are certain alliances that have geopolitical consequences. Of course, for thinking about the big powers, China and the US, or I don't know, of course thinking about these schemes, but also challenging these schemes for understanding power struggles differently. And that is really, I don't have any, I'm not steeped in those conversations, but I know that they need to be done and that this is the time to do it. So that is what it seems to me more important than ever to begin establishing these modes of inquiry. I see NUS, I have heard of NUS as being the center of doing this work, and I see NUS as leading the charge for doing this work.
That kind of related to our lunch conversation that I think Chen Guanxin's Asia's method came out during our lunch conversation. And I think we probably need like Asian kind of method in the study of religion. And I think this is something that is still, that I think scholars of religion probably should engage in this kind of conversation, not only thinking about the region, but also, as you pointed out, thinking across borders, but also thinking about it transregionally, but also in a more global context. So this is something that I think like scholars of religions, including us and our colleagues and graduate students, need to think about in the near future.
I
And
think
yeah.
so. Yeah.
And I guess we still have a lot more work to do.
I would say even more than that, that it's the beginning of the work that needs to be done. Yeah, you know.
Yeah, which means more grant writing and more publications. Yes, Erica.
Hi, my name is Erica Larson. I'm a research fellow in the Religion and Globalization Cluster at the Asia Research Institute here at NUS. I'm also an anthropologist and studying religious coexistence and Christian-Muslim relations in Indonesia. So a lot of your work spoke to a lot of what I do as well. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask was, in your work, how you think about the scale of borders. So obviously you brought up the national borders, and then in the kind of anthropological fashion that I can very much appreciate, you also bring up the kind of social borders or boundaries that can become more fluid. Sort of, you mentioned the cross marriages that happened between the Yemeni and Koreans, and then the sort of public spaces where the Virgin could sort of mark a Christian space, but could also be sort of an overarching kind of symbol. And so I think one of the things I struggle with in my own work, and I'd be really interested to hear you address, is sort of how you think about the scale of borders and these kind of everyday social interactions that I think the methods of anthropology are so great at bringing out, and that you bring out in your work as well. And then also these sort of broader scale questions about national borders and how you can think about them in the same frame.
Early on in my talk, I was really intentional about flagging that when I was talking about borders, I was talking about territorial borders. You know, I mean, I'm going to be answering your question by way of this. And I wanted to be clear that I was interested in territorial borders because, having worked with a lot of students over the years, I think there's a way in which, how do I say this? The term boundaries and borders can signify something like self and other, or symbolic kind of. There can be like these Durkheimian approaches to collectives here. How are these differences between these two communities symbolically mediated? And I think that work is really important. That was work that really needs to be done. And I'm not saying that you said that I was doing this, but I think there's a way in which I want to stay close to the idea of borders as a territorial phenomenon. And what I want to do is make sure that the relationship between the territorial borders as conceived as territorial borders is analyzed in relationship to the symbolic realm, the rhetorical realm, or the material realm, that is the social phenomenology of appearances, so that we keep precise the analytic of borders and the work that it does symbolically and culturally. And so I suppose if there was one takeaway, I hope in term, indeed scale is the term that is appropriate in this context. If there's any kind of takeaway from this lecture for students who are interested in doing work on borders anthropologically, that is using social theory, not necessarily ethnographically per se, but using social theory, I hope that you take away that there is a lot of analytic work and discipline that I invested in linking historically the real fact of a territorial border and contest over border with the symbolic and the material imagination of people. That it's not disembodied or disassociated from the history and the politics of a state border, so that it gives us more of a kind of, that what anthropologists can bring to the table is a deeply contextualized and understanding of a political fact of territorial borders. Does that make sense? I don't know if that got too abstract, but.
We have another question. Yes, Hongshin.
Hi, Prof. Prof. Ho. Thank you for a great lecture. My name is Xuan, Lin Hong Xuan, and I teach at the Department of Southeast Asian Studies, where I am Irving's colleague. I work on the, sorry, this mic is at a very awkward angle. I work on the relationship between Islam and Marxism in Indonesia. So I'm sort of a scholar of religion, although I think it's jurisprudence or fiqh that I'm personally more interested in than theology. In any case, I have a sort of twofold question for you relating to your second project, a really, really interesting project. I was wondering whether you would have, I mean, if you think this is a valid frame of reference, I was wondering whether you would have anything to say about the idea of perhaps these Korean conservative Protestants reacting in a sort of, reacting to a kind of perceived penetration of, or a perceived slight against, or breach of the geo-body of the nation, as Dongchai Winnichakul would have put it, or perhaps even
Wait,
the
slow down. Can you repeat that again? Okay.
Are they sort of reacting to a perceived incursion to the geo-body of the Korean nation, or perhaps even the imagined geo-body of the church, if you like? Because I see a similar sort of expression being made for the Coptic Christians in relation to the loss of access to Jerusalem, right? And so I wonder if that's a frame of reference that makes sense to you. And apart from, but also related to that, is the conservative Protestant reaction also a sort of expression of contestations, culture wars that are going on in the US? And specifically, I'm thinking about the Great Replacement theory, which obviously has very strong roots in certain circles and has penetrated evangelical Christianity in the US in a big way. So is that also what's going on? How does it interact with other kinds of older ideas about the loss of sanctity of the geo-body of the nation or the geo-body of the church? My frame of reference, not yours.
Hong Xuan, can you stay up there? Can you define what you mean by geo-body?
So this is totally lifted from a Thai scholar called Dongchai Winnichakul, who was professor at Wisconsin-Madison for a long time, right?
Yeah.
And so he's talking about, in his book Siam Mapped, he talks about this idea of a Thai nation state that's constructed along with the drawing of territorial boundaries, that's expressed in geographical form and therefore changes the nature of what Siam means. So I'm thinking of, in this case, territorial boundaries as an expression of, or an analog for this imagined, for lack of a better word, body of the church, corpus of the church, or corpus of the state.
That's really interesting. Okay. So I see these two questions as being really different. Is that right? I'm going to answer both of them, but they're not. They're not related, right?
I wonder if they are sort of two ends of the same spectrum.
Okay, maybe I'll just start answering, and then you can pull me to the second if you see a link.
Sure.
I've never been asked this question before, so this is really interesting, and it allows me to kind of explore this comparative framework a little bit more. I mean, whatever comparative means. I mean, it's a difficult kind of even journey to begin on. But I think I've thought about, if we were to take Winnichakul's, is that what I'm saying? Is that how he says this? Yeah. Winnichakul's understanding of the geo-body, taking up that concept, I think I would think more with that in my Egypt work, but in the sense that I've done so much thinking about what Marian apparitions and the Holy Land kind of itinerary has done for exploring Egyptian Coptic Christians' understanding of movement and their imagination of moving through land, through material traces. I've done a lot of work on that, but I've never considered this question for Korean Protestants. The first images that come to mind are all the maps of global evangelism for Korean Protestants. That is, what would be the body politic for Korean? Ostensibly, Korean Protestants belong to a church that is beyond Korean. That's different than Egypt, because Coptic Christianity is Egypt. It's an Egyptian. Yeah. Korean Protestants are famously nationalistic, but it does not mean that the terms of the faith itself, there is no church called Korean Protestantism. It's just a Protestant church. They're part of the global ecumene, whether it's the Conservative Evangelical Alliance or whether it's the World Council of Churches, a more ecumenical body. I mean, it's not as if there's Korea at the center of the world and then it's Protestantism. But but that's the question, is, so certainly there are certain imaginations of the Korean church as being the chosen church after America's failure as a moral leader. That is a certain version of Asian geopolitics centering Asia. But still the actual, because I take seriously the term geobody, I think it's referring to kind of the mapping of space and time onto a conceived polity. And that attention to kind of seriously the space and time of the church, I can only imagine really being materialized through missionary activity, through the imagination of global evangelical, because Korean missionaries are very active and have an understanding of their networks and imagine their networks kind of established in various regions all over the world. And there's different emphases on certain regions of the world as being more unreached, so-called unreached than others. That's a really good question, though. I have to think about it more. So can you help me make the link to the Great Replacement theory?
So I'm wondering, is this, in a sense, an export, like this phenomenon you described, right? Is it an exportation of the American culture wars and, you know, the sort of, frankly, at this moment, Trumpist embrace of Great Replacement? So is Korea simply, in a sense, reflecting what we see in the US?
I certainly hope not, in the sense that I get offended when people refer to Korea as junior varsity to the US, right? Like, no one wants that to be the analytic frame. And I know you're not saying that, but I can see how someone could just be, this is America's culture war just being played out in a sub-imperial satellite kind of location. But I think that's why I go to the refugee history of the Korean War, precisely to point out the specificity of a war that never happened in the US, that shapes the intensification of the dynamics around refugee identity. But that's only one element. There's a whole other series of elements, and I'm sure there are. I don't think, you know, the replacement theory is, I would need to think more of that, but I'm not convinced that this is the same phenomenon in South Korea that we're talking about. Are you talking about a kind of how it's racially and inflected by...
Encoded racially, but expressed in anti-religious terms as well, right? Which is Muslims are bad and brown people are undesirable. But those two things are conflated, whether they like to admit it or not.
Oh, I was thinking more about the anti-Semitic tropes. But you're thinking about, okay, yes. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I have to think about that too a little bit. Because it's that history, it's the history of what the replacement theory is in the US, and it's not the same... it takes up different characteristics at different historical moments.
Conversation for another day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Excellent questions.